There are a lot of good books on the philosophy of religion, but which ones should you read if you're new to the topic? Well, I asked a professional philosopher to give me his top 5 book recommendations for someone like you. If you consider yourself a beginner or even intermediate, I guarantee you there is a book in this list for you. My guest is Dr. Sam Lebens, a professor of philosophy at the University of Haifa. Before launching into his book list, I asked Dr. Lebens what philosophy of religion is all about, and here's what he said.
Traditionally, philosophy of religion is centrally focused on philosophical questions about God and the nature of God, right? So does God exist? And if God does exist, what sorts of properties does that being have? Is the concept of God coherent? Technically speaking, that's not really philosophy of religion. That's philosophical theology, which is just one part of the philosophy of religion. And more broadly, philosophy of religion is asking any philosophical question, any deep question about the nature and value of religion and religiosity, right? So about the nature and value of ritual, the nature and value of belonging in a religious community. Big question I'm interested in is the distinction between belief and faith, these notions that help to animate religion. But still, I think most philosophy of religion is still concentrated just on the theological stuff, which I'm interested in too.
Now it's time to reveal his top 5 book list.
Well, I think I would be betraying my own publishers when asked on the question of a general overview of the philosophy of religion if I weren't to mention the one that I published quite recently. And indeed, we spoke about it in our last interview, Jordan. It's called Philosophy of Religion, the Basics. And with due humility, because it's a massive field with so many books that one could buy. But I did specifically write it to do what you're asking for here, Jordan. It is to give an overview of the entire topic, the philosophy of religion, to look at as many different areas as I could in a short amount of time and relatively concise word count, and to explain to a general readership the main questions that interest philosophy of religion and also some of the main avenues of research. And of course, you can't cover it all in one book, but I did the best I could. So the book discusses what is religion. And as I said, you might not find that in lots of philosophy of religion because they jump straight into God questions. Well, I was interested in what is religion. I talk about philosophy of religious language, where we're interested in the limitations of language. If God exists, is God the sort of being we should be able to describe discursively? I recognize that a lot of your viewers will be from the Christian faith, and in our shared Bible, in what you guys call the Old Testament, I just call the Testament. God says, "My ways are not your ways, my thoughts are not your thoughts." Right. So how can we think that we can do justice to God in human language? That's one chapter I look at. I look at arguments for the existence of God, arguments against the existence of God. I look at arguments for specific religions, arguments for Christianity, arguments for Islam, for Judaism, for Hinduism and Buddhism. I look at some ethical questions about the relationship between religion and ethics. Does religion make us better as people, or does religion make us worse as people? And I even get into political questions about the relationship between religion and state. And all that is under 70,000 words. It's a relatively short book. The number 2 book I'm going to share with you is a book called 24 or So Arguments for God. Okay. It's a lovely book. It's available in paperback with Oxford University Press. In the mid-80s, Plantinga gave a lecture called 24 or So Arguments for God. And it kind of perplexed people because actually a big part of Plantinga's philosophical legacy, I suppose, is the idea that you don't need arguments for God's existence. You don't need to prove that God exists in order to have warranted belief therein, to have warranted belief in God's existence. And yet he thinks there's 24 or so arguments, and people were quite excited about it. And the lecture notes actually used to get passed around from graduate student to graduate student who wasn't able to be there, but they really were just like lecture notes. And then the editors of 24 or So Arguments for God got together and basically recruited a whole host of philosophers, each one to kind of develop one of these 24 or so arguments that Plantinga had hinted to in these lecture notes. And I just think it turned out to be a marvelous collection. Such inventive and ingenious arguments for the existence of God that by the end, you're like, wow, if nothing in here at least moved the needle towards theism, then I don't know what's wrong with you. Look, I understand why there are atheists. So like I said, I'm not saying this book will convert everybody who reads it, but at least to move the needle, at least soften the atheism. I mean, these are interesting and ingenious arguments.
Yeah, that's really good. Okay, what about a third book?
Okay, so in order not to hold your audience in suspense, Jordan, I'll go straight on to the second Plantinga issue, and that's a book called Warranted Christian Belief. As a rabbi of the Orthodox persuasion, it's quite funny when I'm telling people, you must read Warranted Christian Belief. And they go, what, Rabbi, are you sure? But yes, it's a fabulous book. The good thing about Warranted Christian Belief is he does this thing, I've not seen any other author do it. He's got big font and little font. So some of the text is slightly larger and some of the text is slightly smaller. And he basically says, if you want, you can skip the smaller text. So even though it's this big tome, he gives his readers kind of hints as to which bits you can skip if you don't want to get into the too heavy elements. And basically, I still don't know whether I agree with the thesis of the book, right? So I'm not putting this book up here because like I am sold on what's called reformed epistemology, which is the view that Plantinga was putting forward. I'm not sure I am sold on it, but I'm also not sure that I'm not. It's definitely worth thinking about anyway. And basically, the book explores what it means for a belief to be warranted and what it means for a belief to be basic. So the idea is somehow that it's a project in what's called foundationalism. So foundationalism is the view that beliefs must either be warranted by their inferential relationship to other beliefs. So I believe P, and I've really thought hard about P, and I realize that P entails Q. So that gives me justification or warrant for believing Q because of the inferential relationships between P and Q, and I already believe P. Or a belief could be justified because it's kind of self-evident. It functions as one of your foundations. Now, in classical philosophy, there's this view called classical foundationalism that says that a belief should only be allowed to function as a foundation if it really is self-evident. It couldn't possibly be false. Somehow to look at it is to know that it's true. Sadly, classical foundationalism has been shown not to work. Basically, very little really is self-evident. If you become good at doubting things, you can really pretty much doubt anything. So now our foundations are taken from underneath us. What are we going to do? And in a nutshell, I'm really not doing this justice at all. Plantinga says, well, basically, each person has to start with their own foundations, the things which they take as basic. And it might be that the things which strike you as obviously true don't strike me as obviously true. Well, what can we do? Nothing, right? You start from the foundations of what you think is obviously true. I start from the foundations of what I think is obviously true. And then upon those foundations, we try to justify everything else that we believe. And in a nutshell, Warranted Christian Belief as a book kind of plays with the hypothesis, what if our belief in God is somehow properly basic? It's a foundational belief. He thinks like you've got most of our basic beliefs come from our senses, right? So I just believe most of what I see. I believe you exist, Jordan, that you've got this very fancy background in your studio. I believe all that because that's what my eyes delivered to me. And I take that as properly basic. That's non-inferential. And that seems like a reasonable thing for me to do. Well, if God exists, you might think that he gave us a sense for his existence. So that's a big part of the book. People must read it. It's very important. Okay. I'm going to go with, it's very hard what you make me do, Jordan, but I'm going to go with a book by my friend and teacher and mentor, Eleanor Stump, called Wandering in Darkness, which again is a tome. It's huge. But, okay, it's a book about the problem of evil. Okay? I'm sure all of your viewers are aware of what the problem of evil is. If you've got a God who's super good and super knowledgeable and super powerful, then that God shouldn't really allow gratuitous pain and suffering to flourish in his creation. He's good enough not to want that, powerful enough to be able to stop it, and knowledgeable enough to know how. So why isn't he stopping it? That's the problem of evil that leads some people indeed to atheism. Eleanor Stump's take on the problem of evil is that it's actually an interpersonal problem. If you recognize that God is a person and that we too are people, his suffering creatures are people, it's an interpersonal problem to do with relations between persons. And she argues that philosophy can only take you so far in understanding interpersonal relationships, because philosophy likes to abstract. It likes to, when you think about ethics, analytical ethics, you think about trolley problems, right? And in trolley problems, you've got like, there's one person tied to the track here, and there are 5 people tied to the track here, and should you push it or should you not push it? But the thing is, the people are nameless, basically shapeless stick people that you draw on the board. Where in actual fact, the ethical life is made so complicated because of the almost infinite number of variables that inform or flesh out what each person is and what each person means, and the relationships and duties. And she thinks, and she's not alone in thinking this, that storytelling and narrative helps us to understand interpersonal relationships sometimes better than dry analytical argumentation. So the first part of the book is her explaining what she thinks the limitations of philosophy are and what she thinks the benefits of narrative are. And then for a massive part of the book, and this is why I say you don't need to even read the whole thing, you can jump into any one of these. She takes biblical narratives, most of them from the shared part of our Bible, some of them, I think just one from the New Testament, maybe 2, but there's Job and Samson and Abraham. And she just does these beautiful literary readings of biblical texts that are deeply philosophically sophisticated. And then at the end of the book, she pulls together all the insights she hopes you kind of gathered from these narratives, and together with her Thomistic account of what love is, which she gets from Thomas Aquinas, and she's a Catholic philosopher theologian, and it's unsurprising that, and she did a lot of work on Aquinas before she turned to the problem of evil. So it's unsurprising that kind of features. She pulls all these threads together from the narrative and from a Thomistic account of love to try and give a robust and like deeply meaningful response to the problem of evil. I think it's just a masterful work, and not just as a contribution to the problem of evil. It's also just a fabulous piece of work where you think about philosophy in conversation with scripture. Just beautifully done.
Okay, so
Yeah.
5th and final book that you recommend.
Okay. So this is coming from left field, but I thought you're talking to a Jewish philosopher here, so I'll throw one in that's a bit more Jewishy. But I think that it will be really relevant to Christian readers. Okay, the title is 2 Hebrew words. The subtitle will tell you what it's about. It's called Ani Ma'amin. There's no Hebrew in the actual book. It's a book totally in English. The subtitle is Biblical Criticism, Historical Truth, and the 13 Principles of Faith. And it's by a biblical scholar called Joshua Berman. And it's not, strictly speaking, philosophy of religion. He's not a philosopher. But I think he does something that's so important for philosophy of religion. 2 things, one less central and one more central to philosophy of religion. The first thing, which I think is less central, but maybe very important to your viewers, is he brings a huge amount of skepticism to bear upon source criticism of the Hebrew Bible, right? So we're talking about the Old Testament in this book. Although I think many of the lessons that he has to would spill over naturally to how one reads the New Testament as well. So the first thing is he pours a great deal of skepticism upon source criticism. I think he gives compelling reasons, for example, to believe that the book of Exodus was written soon after the reign of Ramses II. That's to say, it was written soon after the events it reports. And he gives compelling reasons drawn from archaeology and drawn from his understanding of the ancient Near East. And that pours cold water, of course, on the hypothesis that it was written much, much, much later.
Like post-exile.
Yeah, exactly. Like post the Babylonian exile. So that was really fascinating to see. And he also has really interesting reasons for thinking that the book of Deuteronomy must have been written around the time that Moses was supposedly alive, because he thinks it's got kind of insider knowledge of certain types of or forms of literature that would have been lost soon after and only recently found by archaeologists, basically Hittite literature that he thinks the book of Deuteronomy is modeled upon. So that's fascinating, but not for philosophers necessarily. Here's the thing that I think is crucial for philosophy of religion is you and I, for example, we're both super into analytic philosophy of religion, but we also believe in scripture. Okay. And sometimes the findings of philosophy or the findings of the empirical sciences can come into conflict with scripture. But whether or not the conflict is superficial or deep depends upon how scripture is supposed to be read. Okay. And a lot of that depends upon what genre, okay, are the various books of scripture that we're reading. And Berman argues that only if you understand the various literary genres of the ancient Near East are you going to have a proper appreciation of what was being communicated, at least to the original audiences. Look, I'm sufficiently religious that I think God can communicate to multiple generations different things through the same words. So what God's communicating to me now through scripture might not be the same as God was communicating to the ancient first audiences. Nonetheless, did the original audiences of the ancient Near East imagine that Genesis was a book of history? Did they imagine that, well, it says there's a flood, so there must have been a flood. It says it was the whole world, must have been the whole world. It says Adam was created from the mud and Eve was created from the rib, so it must be. Is that an assumption that ancient readers of the text would have had or not? And this is the sort of thing that Berman gets into. And I think that it would allow, I think, philosophers to be much more sophisticated in navigating potential conflicts or contradictions between, so to speak, faith and reason, if they had a better understanding of what scripture originally meant to its original audiences. And I think that would be equally true of the New Testament as of the Old Testament. And I think it's a great place to start. I think it's probably the best single volume written against the kind of mainstream views of reductive, source critical, biblical criticism that's out there.
After finishing my interview with Dr. Lebens, there were no readings to my knowledge that argue for atheism, and that is an important part of the philosophy of religion. And there's one book in particular that I personally have read a significant portion of at this point, though not all. And there are readings in this book that are by atheist philosophers, and they are arguing for atheism. So I thought that it would be important to include this book in this list. I found it helpful. I think you would find it helpful as well. That book is The Philosophy of Religion, an Anthology by Michael Ray and Louise Pojman. There are 7 parts of the book, and for each part, there are several readings, some by theists, some not. So part 1 focuses on concepts of God, and a big part of these readings is the attributes of God. Part 2 focuses on traditional arguments for the existence of God, so things like the cosmological argument, the teleological argument. Part 3 is about evil and the hiddenness of God. And part 4 is on religious experiences and also miracles. Part 5 is on faith and reason. Part 6 is on religious pluralism. And part 7 is on death and immortality. So that gives you a quick, broad picture of the book. If you're brand new to the topic, start with the Sam Lebens book. And then once you read that book, I think this one would be the perfect next step. You would dive into specific essays on topics that interest you the most, and I would just explore from there. The philosophy of religion is a huge field, and it's so much fun to explore. But a lot of you are interested in a particular religion, namely Christianity. That's probably why you're watching my channel. What better way to end this video than by saying, if you want to know what the top 5 books are on Christian philosophy in particular, then click this video right here.